Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to our Wetland Aquarium Online Academy. I'm Stacy here at the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California, and we're going to explore these amazing habitats called wetlands. Now, if you are tuning in this morning, it's Friday morning, you can actually interact with us by texting us. So right there, we have our text number 562-286-1838, and you can text us here at the studio. My friend Cynthia is hanging out over at our text line, and she will relay all of the things that you text in to me so I can answer some of the questions you have, or maybe even see some of the observations that you might want to share with us. Now, my friend Carrie is on the other side of our computer here to show us all the beautiful imagery that we have. So the team here at the Aquarium of the Pacific is ready for our wetlands program. Okay, I hope that you're ready because we're going to explore this beautiful habitat. Now, a habitat, have you ever thought about that word before? How would you describe a habitat? And if it's been a while since you've said the word, you can even say that word, right? Habitat. I actually like saying it 3 times really fast. Habitat, habitat, habitat. It's funny. It's a funny word. But what is a habitat? Now, you might remember, or maybe if you don't, that's okay. We're going to learn it together. A habitat is a place where animals can live, right? And a habitat is not just about the animals and the other living things, but it's also about the things that are not alive too. So this here is a wetland habitat. I want you to take a moment and observe it. Take a look. What do you notice about this habitat? How is it different than other places that are animals' home? How is this different from like a desert? How is this different from a coral reef? How about a rainforest? Very different, right? So this is a wetland. And if you think about the name of this habitat, it kind of tells you a lot about it. A wetland has wet land. Go figure, yes? So what we see right here is land, and it's pretty wet. And then, of course, you have to have water nearby in order to have wet land, right? So a wetland has to have water at some part of the year. It doesn't even have to be the whole year. And there's so many different types of wetlands in our world. This wetland right here is an estuary. An estuary is actually salt water from the ocean and fresh water from the land that come together and mix up. And when you have water that is salty and water that is fresh and you mix it up, you get something kind of in the middle. It's a little bit salty. And so this is an estuary with water that's a little bit salty, okay? There's other kind of wetlands out there too. Have you ever heard of a swamp or maybe a bog? Those are different kinds of wetlands too. Now, the ones we're going to explore today are estuaries, like the one that we see right here. So estuaries have water that is a little bit salty. What else do you notice about this estuary? I really love and notice these beautiful plants, right? These plants are a really important part of this wetland. Now, wait a minute. Have you ever thought about watering a plant before? What kind of water do you use? I mean, I use water from my sink or maybe from a hose, and that water is fresh water, right? That's water that has no salt at all, because most plants out there, you can't put salt in. If you did, the plants wouldn't do so good. So wait a minute. This is a plant that can live with water that has a little bit of salt in it. Isn't that crazy? Well, here's the thing. All of the parts of an ecosystem or a habitat, like the plants and like the animals, have parts about them, stuff about them that help them survive in that habitat. Those things, they're called adaptations. Can you say that? Adaptation. Okay, so adaptations are the things that are going to help living things continue to live. We have adaptations too. One of my favorite adaptations, my fingers. The reason why I love having fingers is because they let me do a lot of things. One of the things they let me do, one of my favorite things they let me do, is snack. Yep, they help me to grab food so I can eat it. All right, so that's a really good adaptation, right? Fingers help us to survive. Another thing that helps us survive, let's see, my heart. Our hearts help us survive, right? Our hearts are beating, bum, 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 bum. And that's pushing blood all around in our body, and that's really important for our bodies. So those are some adaptations that we have to help us survive. All of these plants and all of the animals also have adaptations. They might be different. So we're going to explore that a little bit today. We'll look at some animals and plants that live in an estuary and try to figure out how they survive. What are their adaptations? So let's get back to those plants. How are they going to live with salt, right? Most plants, if you have salt water and you water them with salt water, they're not going to survive. So these plants have to have those special adaptations to help them get rid of salt. And they have them. All right. Now let's take a look at a plant that you might find in a place like an estuary. And we're going to figure out how they survive. Okay, so here's a plant. It's pretty. I love the little flowers. Look at those leaves. They're itty bitty. But wait a minute. What do you notice on the leaves? What colors do you see here? Well, I see green, but I also see white. Now, it would be easy for us to go, oh, okay, so this leaf must be a green leaf with white polka dots. But here's the thing. It's not white polka dots. Not really. That white that we see is actually salt. So this plant can live with salt water because it sucks in the salt water, it uses the water, and then it gets rid of the salt by sweating it onto their leaves. So yes, plants sweat. And I think most of us don't even realize that plants sweat, but they do. All the plants do. But this plant in particular can not just sweat out water, but it also sweats out salt. And that's a really cool adaptation. So this leaf here, if we were to pluck it and lick it, it would actually be kind of salty because all of that salt that has been sitting on this leaf. It's a really great way to get rid of salt. Now, not all estuary plants get rid of salt by sweating. Some of them get rid of salt in a slightly different way. Now, this is actually one of my favorite estuary plants. It is called pickleweed. So just imagine, what would pickleweed look like if it's called pickleweed? I'm imagining pickles. But it actually doesn't look like pickles. It tastes like pickles. Now, I personally have never tasted it before, but I've heard it's actually quite good. Do you like pickles? Do you like salty things? That's kind of what this plant tastes like. Now, what do you notice about this plant? We noticed the other plant had green leaves with white polka dots, right? What do you notice about this plant? Well, I see a lot of green, but I also see some yellow and even some red, right? So this plant, instead of sweating salt out, instead it gets rid of salt by pushing the salt to the very end. It pushes it and pushes it and pushes it and pushes it. And so it makes all of the salt go to the ends like this. And then the ends like this just fall off, and then it got rid of the salt. Now, the reason it's called pickleweed, like I said, it tastes like pickles, it's this part. The red part of a pickleweed, if you were to eat that, would kind of taste salty and pickly. And that's how it gets its name. Now, it doesn't always just have red tips. You'll see the little bits of yellow there. The yellow means it has a little bit of salt. And then it'll turn kind of orangey and that's a little bit more. The red means it has a lot of salt. And so that's the part that is like basically full of salt that the plant will just drop off after a while, and then it got rid of the salt. So these plants have amazing adaptations that help them survive even with salt water. So you have a lot of plants, you're probably going to have a lot of animals, right? So we're now going to move on from plants to take a look at maybe some other living things that call this wetland home. Now, we actually had someone text in that there is a trail by a marsh near them, and they can lick the plant that is salty, and that's true. So there are a couple of different plants that do that. They sweat out salt, and those leaves look kind of salty. Now, I don't know how often I would want to lick salt off of plants, but it is kind of a neat thing to touch. So if you know that that is a plant that is safe to touch, you can actually touch the leaves of them and go like this, and it almost feels like really fine sand because it's salt, right? You maybe have touched salt before. So it's kind of grainy, kind of feels like sand. It's pretty cool. Now, we see all those plants, right? So lots and lots of plants. But what else did you notice in this here? Look at all those birds. So these birds are other animals that you might find in a wetland. In fact, here in California, we have a lot of birds that call these wetlands home. Some of them live at a wetland or at an estuary all year round. That is their home, and they're sticking to it. But there's other birds that like to migrate. Have you ever heard that word before? Migration? Migration is actually moving from one place to another because of a change of season. All right, so maybe you have heard of birds migrating. Maybe you've heard of the monarch butterflies that migrate. When seasons change, these animals will move. And a lot of that's because sometimes it gets too cold. And so it's too cold, so they need to move to a place that's a little bit warmer. But then after a while, they want to find the best food. And the best food is back where they started. All right. And so they're going to be migrating back and forth and back and forth. These wetlands or estuaries are perfect places for a lot of migrating birds here in Southern California. In fact, there's this, it's almost like a freeway. It's called a Pacific Flyway. And that's because all these birds will take that Pacific Flyway and they will go to lots of different wetlands that they find along that, basically a road for birds, in order to rest, in order to do what these birds are doing. Do you notice what they're doing? Did you notice they're kind of pecking at the mud? Now, for us, walking and pecking at mud is not something we would want to do, right? But remember, we are different. We have different adaptations. And so these birds are actually pecking at the mud because there is delicious, delicious food hanging out in the mud. All right. So one of the questions that we got here is, why do birds migrate instead of just staying in the warmer areas year round? That's a really good question. A lot of times it has to do with food. It could also do with nesting opportunities. So where they start is going to be a little bit different than where they go, right? And so here in North America, oftentimes these birds kind of live up north in the summertime, and then in the winter, they fly south. And they'll kind of go back and forth like that. Well, the food is really, really good in the north. And sometimes the nesting material that they really need is kind of somewhere in the middle. And so that's why they're going to travel, because the different habitats they visit might have different things for them. For example, these habitats like an estuary have great nesting material for these birds. Also, if you see how thick this grass is, there are some birds that actually nest in grass like this, and it's so thick that it's really hard for predators to see them. So that's why they travel. There's kind of different things for them at different places. It's kind of like why we travel too, right? Maybe you want to go on vacation somewhere because there's a sandy beach, and so you're going to go there, but you also like the mountains. So maybe you'll go to the mountains a little bit later. So there's that opportunity too for people. In a way, it's similar to birds, but they depend on it even more than people do. They don't have bird grocery stores around. So that's a really good question there. We also have a question asking if people can get salt from the plants for kitchen seasoning. So I think it's much easier for us to get salt from a grocery store. And that's probably why a lot of us do that, because it's already just there. You buy it. It's not too expensive. And so it's very, very easy. But the people who would call this home would have, before grocery stores, could actually get salt from plants. So around Southern California, we have the Tongva people who called a lot of these wetlands home. And that's one of the things that they would use to get salt, is actually the salt on the leaves of the plants. So awesome question. Now, back to these birds here. There's some delicious food in that mud. What do you think lives in mud that a bird might want to eat? You probably are thinking worms, right? I mean, I think a lot of us think about birds eating worms. And it's true, a lot of birds do eat a lot of worms. And yes, there are a lot of worms in this mud here, but it's not just worms. There's a lot of different types of worms, but also what you'll find in this mud are things that almost look like little bugs. And they call the mud home. That's delicious food for them. Even little clams, little snails. So many animals, typically smaller animals, will find their homes in this mud. So these birds will walk around and try to capture all of those little things that live in the mud. Now, one of the best ways to capture that is with a beak that looks like theirs. Maybe we can get a picture of one of these birds up close. Oh, cool, even a video. Take a look at those beaks. Oh, well, now we can't. There we go. We'll look at them again. So this video is going to kind of play continuously. So we'll get a chance to look here. That beak is very, very long. And that long beak allows them to get into the mud. Now, even if they're in shallow water, they can stick that beak into the mud to get food and their faces don't get wet. Because who wants a wet, muddy face? Not these birds, right? So these long beaks are going to help them to actually capture the food in the mud. Now, what else do you notice on this bird in particular that helps them walk around in water and mud? Those long legs, right? A lot of birds that you're going to find in a wetland like an estuary have long beaks and long legs. And that allows them to walk around in shallow water. They can walk around in mud, peck on the mud to get their food, and they don't get their feathery bodies wet. Because wet feathery bodies can get very heavy, right? Water is heavy. So that's one of the reasons why they want to try to stay dry, right? So these long legs can actually help them with their lives. It helps them survive. Another great adaptation. So these birds are pretty incredible, but not all birds in a wetland look like these ones. Now you do find many different colors. These ones here are kind of shiny, black and brown. I think they're gorgeous. I even see little hints of green. But there's other birds that live in wetland habitat that might be white. There's some that might have blues and grays. There's so many different color birds that call this place home. Here we go. This is a really great example of a bird that's a different color. So what colors do you notice here? Did you notice the wispy white feathers? What about that cool yellow mask? And check out those feet. Maybe let's get rid of our numbers there so we can see those feet even better because, oh my goodness, I love those feet. Aren't they cute? Well, they're big, especially for this bird. But they're so cute, right? They have yellow toes. So this is an animal called a snowy egret. And here's a funny way that I learned how this is a snowy egret. There is another bird that lives here close to Long Beach called a great egret. They look very, very similar. Great egrets are bigger. Snowy egrets are smaller. But here's another way that I learned. Snowy egrets have yellow feet because they walked in yellow snow. That's what I heard. Whereas great egrets are great. They're big. They did not walk in yellow snow. They have feet, all right, or pink feet, kind of depending on the egret. So this snowy egret has yellow feet. Why would yellow feet be a good adaptation? I mean, they really stand out in that sand, don't you think? So it's not camouflage. Camouflage is being able to hide. So these feet are not going to be able to hide. So how are they helpful? I'll let you know. These feet are what they use for fishing. They'll actually stand in the water like this, and when they're hungry and there's a lot of little fish around, they'll wiggle their toes and they'll wiggle their foot. And they look like little worms. See how skinny they are? And they're bright yellow, so those little fish can see them. So the little fish are like, ooh, food. And a little fish comes to bite their toe. But guess what happens? The bird eats the fish. So this is a way that this bird can actually fish for food. Having yellow feet is a really, really beneficial thing. So you'll notice that there are some other similarities that we had with that other bird, right? That long, skinny beak, so it doesn't get a wet face when it puts its face in, or when it puts its beak in water. And also those long, skinny legs, so it can walk around in water and its body doesn't get soaking wet and too heavy to fly. So again, really great adaptations for these wetland birds. Now, we need to have wetlands around, because we were saying that this is a great place for these birds to stop over, right? They're migrating. So they're moving from really far north to really far south. And you can't do that in one go. Not very many birds can fly that far without getting some rest. So wetlands are an incredibly important place for them to stop as they fly down. It allows them a place to rest. It allows them a place where they can find food. It gives them a place to have babies even. Wetlands are incredibly important habitats. But here's the thing, wetlands are disappearing. We as people love living near the coast. The coast is really nice, right? Who doesn't want to live near a beach or near the ocean? Because as you can see here, it's often cooler, it's really pretty, and people tend to like to be near water. But when you have a lot of wetland like this and people who live nearby, if we start building houses closer and closer to the water, those wetlands start to disappear. And this is kind of what's going on, especially in really any place or near a coast where you can find a lot of wetlands. Here in California, we've lost 90% of our wetlands. Now, what does that look like if you put up your 10 fingers? And make all fingers go away except for one? This is how much wetland we have left in California. We used to have this much, now we only have this, right? So it's not very much, but what we have now is incredibly important, and those animals need it. So we want to make sure that wetlands stay protected, they stay around, and they stay clean, so these plants and these animals can survive in them. One way that we can do that that's very simple for us is to make sure that all of our trash in a trash can, it's recyclable. Try to recycle it. That's a really simple thing, because remember how we said that water comes from the ocean for an estuary or a wetland like we've been exploring, right? The water can come from the ocean or the water can come from land, and they come together and they mix. Well, the water from land can also bring trash from the streets. And so we want to keep trash out of the streets. So that way our wetlands don't get too much trash, because those plants and those birds need a nice, clean place to live, eat, rest, and have their babies. Well, everybody, I want to say thank you all so much for your patience this morning, waiting for us to come on over. I do appreciate you joining us for our wetland exploration today. If you have more questions, because I think wetlands are amazing, they really make you think, I would love for you to send us an email. It's right down there, live@lbaop.org. The educators here at the Aquarium of the Pacific get those emails, and we can send you a response back. Now, if you haven't had a chance to check out a wetland before, I encourage you to do so. You can probably find it on the internet. Maybe ask your parents to help you out to locate one. And it's a really neat place to go, because there's tons and tons of life. You just sometimes have to look a little bit carefully. But there's definitely a lot of plant life, right? Now, one of the best times to go to a local wetland in Southern California is in the late winter or early spring. That's when we tend to have those migrating birds come through, and we have them in a huge group. And there's so many different kinds. You can compare them, contrast them, watch what they're doing too, because it's pretty fun to look at their behavior as well. All right, my friends, thank you all so much for joining us. Teachers, if you happen to have a group of kids watching with you, if you can text us the number of students that you have, it's really helpful for us to kind of keep documentation of how many views we have for each of our programs. So thank you all again for joining us. Bye.